Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we're gonna create a simple PDF viewer, which is one of the projects that I showed you in this video. I'm gonna leave the link to that video in the description, so if you are interested, you can check it out. Okay, so let's see a demo of the final work. Here we can open a PDF file and we can then move to different pages. We can zoom in and zoom out. So this is what we will create. Now, before I move on and get started with the coding part, I want to say if you haven't subscribed to the channel, make sure you do it so you don't miss the future videos. And if you watched the video and enjoyed it, you can hit the like button as well. And I really appreciate it. So now I'm going to open the text editor and you see that we already have some files. We have a HTML file and we have a CSS file for styling, but we will not go through the HTML and CSS codes because we will just focus on a JavaScript part. For that, first you can open this HTML file, and then the first step that we have to do is to include a JavaScript library which is called PDF.js. We're going to use it for rendering PDF files. So to include it, you can go to this page. So I'm going to leave the link to this page in the description and you can find it there. Then we can either download the source code and then include it, or we can use a CDN, so which I will do. So I'm going to open this link in another tab. Then I can copy the script tag and then I can paste it here. So now I have the PDF.js library included. We can create a JavaScript file. So you can create here in this folder, JS. I'm going to name it index.js. And then we also need to include this JavaScript file in here in the HTML file. And we can do it by typing script. And then the source will be current folder, JS, and index.js. Then we can start writing our JavaScript codes here in this index.js file. Now here we can start by selecting some elements from the HTML code. And for that we need to create some variables. So the first variable that I'm going to create it will be called zoom button, and then assign it to document get element by ID, and the ID will be zoom. So here we are selecting the zoom button. Then I'm going to create another variable and call it input, then assign it to document get element by ID, and the ID will be input file. And then I'm going to create another variable and call it the open file, and then assign it to document get element by ID, and the ID will be open PDF. So this input that we selected is actually this input tag, which is by default hidden, so user can't click on this input. And this open file is this button. So later we will add a click event listener on this button, and when user click on this button, so this input should be clicked as well. So because, as I said, this click is hidden and user can't click on it by default. Then I'm going to create another variable and call it the current page. Then assign it to document get element by ID, and the ID will be current underline page. Then I'm going to create another variable. So this will be the last element that we want to select. So I'm going to call it viewer. Then assign it to document get this time we can use query selector, and then select an element with the class name PDF-viewer. So I have to spell it right, so viewer. So and this viewer will be this canvas tag. And it should be a canvas tag, otherwise it will not work. So now I'm gonna create another variable, which will be the last one. So I'm gonna call it current PDF. then assign it to an empty object. And in this object, we will store some informations like the current PDF files content, the count of pages, the current page, or zoom value. So we can create a function and call it the reset current PDF, and inside the function we can assign this current PDF, this variable, to an object which has a key called the file, and this file will be null by default, and also another key which is called the count of pages, and by default it is 0. The current page will be 1, so the first page, and the zoom value by default it will be 1.5, so that means that the zoom value will be 150%. And we are creating this function because we want to call this function each time user want to open a new PDF file, so we can reset these values to the default values. Okay, so now we can add event listener on this open file button, so user can open a PDF file. So we can type open PDF and then add event listener. The type of event will be click, and for the callback function we can type inside the callback function input and then click. So as I said, this input by default is hidden, so user can't click on it, but when user click on this open button, so we can run this method, so this input will be clicked as well. We can also add an event listener on this input, so we can type input add the event listener, and the type of the event will be changed. So each time the value of this input is changed, we want to run this function, and we also need to pass the event as argument to this function. And here inside this callback function, we can start by creating a variable, and then we can call it the input file, and then we can assign it to event target files, and then the file at index 0, so it will be the first file. So this part of the code will get the first file that user selected and then store it to this variable. Now let's check if the selected file is a PDF file. So for that we can create if statement and then check if the input file and then the type is equal application and then PDF. So if it is, we can do something, but first we can check for the else statement. So if the file is not a PDF file, so we can send an alert to user and say the file you selected is not a PDF file. Okay, but what if the file is a PDF file? So for that we can create a file reader object first. So I'm gonna call it reader and then assign it to new file reader. So we're gonna use it to read the content of the selected file. Then we can type reader and then read as data URL, and then we can pass this input file as argument to it. Oops, should be just input file. And then when the read process is done, we want to run this this function, and here in this function the first thing that we want to do is to call another function, which we didn't create yet, but we're gonna create it after we are done with this event listener. So that function will be called load PDF, and then we can pass a reader.result as argument to it. So this reader.result is the content of the file that user selected. And then after that, we want to set zoom button disabled to false, because by default it is true. Now let's create this load PDF function, and we can do it here after this event listener. So we can type function load PDF, and it has a parameter, so I'm gonna call it data. Inside the function, we can call the reset current PDF function, so it will reset the current PDF to the default values. And why I'm calling it here is because this load PDF function will be run each time user want to read a new PDF file, so it will be a great place. Then I'm gonna create a variable and call it PDF file. And here it will be the first time that we want to use PDF.js library, and we can do it by typing PDF.js lib. Then we're gonna use a method which is called getDocument, and we can pass data as argument to it. This getDocument method will return a promise, so we can use it here by typing. Usually we can just type dot then when we are working with the promises, but here we have to add the promise between this PDF file and this then method. This promise will give us a document object, so we can pass it as argument to this callback function. And here inside this callback function, we can set current pdf.file to this document object. Then we can set current pdf.count of pages to doc.num pages. And now what we need to do is to make this canvas, this viewer, visible, because by default you see that it has a class name hidden which make it invisible. And we also need to make this h3 tag invisible. So we can start by this canvas, and we can and as you remember, we already selected here, so we can type viewer.classList and then remove class name hidden. Then we can select that h3 tag, and we can do it by typing document query selector, and then we want to select main h3, then a class list. This time we want to add class list hidden to this h3 tag. Then here I'm gonna call a function which we're gonna create after this load PDF function, and I'm gonna name it render current page. So it will render the current page to this viewer so user can see it. Now let's create it here. So we can create it here after this load PDF function. So I can type function name, and inside this function we can start by typing current pdf.file, which is same as this document that we assigned it here. And then we're going to use a method which is called getPage, and this method takes an argument which is the page number that we want to get, and in this case it will be current pdf.current page. And because this method will return a promise, we can use then method, and here the promise will give us a page. And inside this this callback function, I'm gonna create a variable and call it context, and assign it to viewer get context, and pass 2D as argument to it. Then I'm gonna create another variable and call it view port and assign it to page get view port. And here we have to pass an object which has a key called scale, and the value will be current PDF dot zoom. So basically here in this line we are specifying the zoom value for the PDF file, and then we can specify the viewer height and the width. So we can type viewer height and we can assign it to viewport dot height. So this viewport dot height is same as the PDF's height, and then we can do the same for the width. Then I'm gonna create another variable and call it the render context and assign it to an object which has a key called the canvas context, and then the value will be context, which is this variable, and it will have another key which is called view port, and then the value will be this viewport variable. So after that we're gonna use a method which is from this page, which is called render. So it will render the current page, and we have to pass this variable as argument to it. So we can do it by typing page render, and then should be just render, so render, and then we can pass a render context as argument to it. Now we need to update this text which shows the current page number, and we can do it here after this part. So we can type current page, which is this variable that we created at beginning, and in this variable we stored this element, so which is the same as this part. So we can set the inner HTML to the current PDF current page, so it should be current page plus, and here we can type off and then plus current PDF count of pages. So now this function is done as well, and before I move on, I want to check if everything worked correctly so far, and for that I'm gonna run these codes, and to run it we can go to the HTML code and right click, then open with the live server. Here I'm gonna open a PDF file, and as you can see the PDF file was opened successfully, and that means everything worked just fine. But we are not able to go to the next page or previous page, and we can't zoom in or zoom out. So now let's add functionality to them, and we can start by these two buttons. For that we can go back to this index.js file, and here after this event listener we can type document get element by ID. The ID will be next, which is same as this button. So this button has the ID next, and then we can add event listener to it. The type of event will be click, and for the callback function, so here inside the callback function we can create another variable and call it is valid page, then assign it to current PDF current page is less than current PDF count of pages. So here we are checking if there is some next page, and we can do it by checking if the current page is less than count of pages, because if this current page is equal to count of pages, or if it is greater than count of pages, so that means there isn't any next page and this is valid page will be false. Now let's create a if statement and check if is a valid page. So if there is some next page, we can then increase the current PDF current page by 1. Then we can call this render current page function, and that's it. So now let's do the same for the previous page, and we can copy this code, paste it here, so it will be quite similar. So all we need is to change this next to previous. So here it will be this button, and then inside this callback function we can change this is valid. The content will be, we can change it to, so we can assign this is valid page to the current PDF current page -1 is greater than 0. So if we are checking if we decrease the current page by 1 and still we are greater than 0, so that means there is a previous page. So therefore we can then decrease the current page by 1 and then run this render current page. And that's it for that as well. So now there is just one more thing left, and it is this zoom button. And for that we can first select it. So we can do it here. We can, or we already did it. So here, this zoom button. So all we need is to type zoom button, then add the add event listener. The type of event will be input. And then for the callback function, so here inside the callback function, we can first check if current PDF dot file. So if there is some file in this file, so if it isn't null, then we can select this part and update this percentage text. So to do that, we can type document get element by ID. The ID will be zoom value. Then we can set the inner HTML to zoom button dot value plus %sign. We also need to change this or update this zoom from current PDF. So we can type current PDF dot zoom. Then we can assign it to zoom button value, and because this value is a string, we need to convert it to integer, and we can do it by using parse int function and pass this value as argument to it. We also need to divide it by 100 because you see that that value is from 100 to 300, and the number we want is from 1 to 3. Then finally we can call this render current page function, and that will be the last part that we needed to do. Now all we need to do is to check if everything works as it should. So for that, I'm gonna open the web browser one more time, and I can open a PDF file. So you see that the PDF file was opened successfully. We can move to different pages. We You can zoom in and zoom out, so everything worked as we expected. So that means this will be the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it was helpful for you. So see you in another video.